Hey everyone, this is Wild and Woolly Gaming. Just coming to you today because I came up with an idea for a video, essentially kind of giving the history of the ME-262. It's the first operational jet fighter that was mass produced, and specifically the HG series, being the 1, 2, and 3, with an emphasis more on the 1 and 2, being that those were actual planes that did fly. As far as I know, the HG2 did fly, but there's pretty limited data on it. So, I'm making this video essentially to it's for numerous audiences. One, for people who are just interested in the ME262 HG series, and the other audience is the War Thunder audience. I've been playing War Thunder quite a bit. I'm pretty well versed in it. I've got quite a bit of time in it. Not embarrassing. I'm actually quite fond of the game, and really I'm looking at kind of discussing why Gaijin might or might not include the HG prototypes, but specifically why they might include the HG1 and possibly the HG2. So let's begin. I'm just going to kind of go over a real basic history of the ME262. To kind of give you an idea of what it is and maybe its place in history as well as in War Thunder. So, the ME-262, as stated before, is the first mass-produced jet fighter ever. Right? It first took flight in, I believe it was 42 under the with the Junkers Jumo 004, and it first actually became operational in 44. Now, this was a revolutionary design and it was incredibly fast. I mean, it could outpace any other plane by probably well over 100 miles per hour, which is absurd. I mean, imagine sitting still and then having some guy go down the road at 100 miles per hour in front of you. It would almost seem like a speeding bullet. Uh, of course, obviously not as fast as a speeding bullet, but you get the idea. Now, this was, again, a revolutionary design, and the initial design was actually thought of in the 30s. And that initial design had the engines melded with the fuselage, which more or less explains, or the reason being for the wide body fuselage, is because they created it to house the engines. But there were issues with the engines, the Junkers Jumo 004, and so they were heavier than expected. I believe they were a little bit larger than expected, and so they were actually moved to the wings. Now this created another design feature which is prominent on the ME262, and that is the swept wing. Now it's not an incredibly swept wing, and people like to point out, hey, it's got swept wings, maybe it can go faster than the speed of sound. The wings are not swept high enough so that it would affect really the critical Mach number sufficiently for it to break the speed of sound, nor did it really even have the power to do so, even in a dive. But that being said, so the wings were swept and the engines were placed where they were so that the center of gravity would be more in the middle of the plane. Whereas if they were further out, on a straight wing aircraft, the plane would likely have gone a little bit slower, but also the center of gravity would have been a little bit worse. So, I mean, it's an interesting issue, the problems that arose from the Junkers Jumo 004 and how they solved them, giving it really distinctive design features. So, that being said, again, the main focus of this video is the HG series, right? The HG1 and HG2 specifically, being that the HG1 definitively did fly, and the HG2, depending on who you're reading it from, also did fly. So I'll start with the HG1. Now, this is quoted from ME262, Stormbird Ascending. I have to give them credit. The HG1, it was an airframe. It was the ME262 HG1 V9 work number 130003. And forgive me if I mispronounce this. I'm not entirely German. With Stammkennzeichen of V1 plus AD. So this was prepared with a low-profile Rennkabine racing canopy and may have achieved an unofficial record speed for a turbojet-powered aircraft of 975 kilometers per hour, or 606 miles per hour. The altitude here was unspecified. Again, that was from ME-262 Storm we were descending. So that being said, it had, from what I just said here, from what I just read, it had a racing canopy, and the pictures you can research, you can look them up yourself. It's incredible how low this canopy was. And also from other sources I had read, largely forum posts, but those had citations in them. They had also smoothed out the aircraft. Now the ME-262 was well known for being a rough plane to touch. Right, it was just a very rough plane, and it had a lot of parasitic drag. As a lot of people might or might not know, parasitic drag is one of the main reasons for planes not going as fast as they could, right? So just by smoothing out the surface of the plane, as well as adding a low profile, low drag canopy, all of a sudden you're adding 66 miles per hour to the top speed. That's over 10% with minor changes to the design. Same engine, same everything else. Just a worked over canopy and a fresh, basically a polishing more or less on the airframe. Now, just to kind of liken this to cars, so that you get the idea of what parasitic drag does, I believe it's the 2017 Dodge Viper ACR itself had a top speed that was significantly, I mean, dozens of miles per hour slower than the regular Dodge Viper, vehicles that you would see, because it had such a huge, rear spoiler. And this rear spoiler, actually, people who would tow them on trucks, on like a Jeep or something, on a trailer, they would notice that versus other Dodge Vipers that these people may have owned, and I had read a story about this, that their fuel efficiency actually goes down while towing the ACR with a huge rear spoiler by, I believe it was 1 or 2 miles per hour, which is not a ton, but it's still an interesting thing when you look at it overall. And such drag, especially in a plane, could have huge ramifications on its performance. So, the HG2 was somewhat of a revolution, and this took flight, shortly, I believe it was in 44, not too long after or before the HG, or the ME-262 A1 actually became operational. So one would have to wonder, why did the Luftwaffe not just retool their facilities to make this plane, operational, to put it in production? I wouldn't have the answer for that. I wouldn't know. The maneuverability, one would also have to assume, because the drag is reduced, would have to be a little bit better. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just too creative a feat. Maybe they deemed it to be unusable, because at the end of the day, the Willie Messerschmitt actually put a limit on the speed. He told pilots do not go above, I believe it was 0.82 times the speed of sound, because the plane would essentially lose control and go into an uncontrollable dive, and you would die. So it was not something that they were looking to do. So maybe they deemed the 540 mile per hour, give or take, top speed to be sufficient. Now, this top speed itself was kind of interesting, because I've also read from other sources that the top speed was really dependent on the airframe that was made to create the aircraft. So some high quality airframes, I've heard, could get as fast as 550 or 560 miles per hour, whereas lower quality ones would more or less be hamstrung at 520. There was a range, and people kind of assume that, let's say production plant A or 1 versus, 2 or 3 might have more or less the same quality, but they did not. I mean, this was a Germany whose war situation was deteriorating, and quickly. I mean, you had Allied bombing raids of hundreds or over 1,000 bombers striking facilities, strategic targets, population targets, arguably strategic target in Dresden, many other places that were just totally annihilating any capability for Germany to create war. And this is really shown if you look at late war photos of Focke-Wulf 190s and whatnot. You'll see them landed in a forest. I mean, they had forest clearings that were essentially used as makeshift runways. And it was like that everywhere. So these planes were really just, you took a chance by getting into a plane, especially with the potential flameouts with the Junkers Jumo 004. They were by no means a perfect plane or engine. And oftentimes, I mean, towards the end of the war, production really just how they made it became a little bit better, so you wouldn't have it where it had to be completely overhauled after 10 hours of flight and 25 hours it would have to be replaced. More so, they lasted a little bit longer, but that leads me to another point with the Junkers Jumo 004. So everyone, again, I would, it seems like kind of assumes that the Junkers Jumo 004 was more or less a static development, right? That they just made it and that was it. Most people don't really have as much knowledge on engines as they do, the plane itself, the things that carries the engine. So the 004 had numerous iterations, and to me, one of the most, one of the greatest iterations and most interesting is really the 004E. So this was actually the first engine produced with an afterburner. So you're looking at, I believe it was around 11.5 kilonewtons of force, as opposed to the regular Junkers Jumo 004, which, again, depending on the production quality, put out anywhere around 8 or 8.5, kilonewtons of force. So this itself had tremendous potential for the future, and one would have to imagine that on later iterations of the ME-262, especially being that it was ready for production in 45 by around the time that the war had ended, one would have to imagine that the ME-262 and its variants would really have received this or some iteration of it. Again, it was still a work in progress, but it was ready to be produced. They deemed it ready for production. So that being said, the ME-262 HG2 was an even wilder sort of derivation of the ME-262. And this, I believe, featured the same racing canopy, but it also featured wings that were swept at about 35 degrees back, which is similar to post-war designs like the MiG-15, the F-86 Sabre, and the variants of those, as well as other designs. Now, this would have been more of a revolution. I believe the engines were actually placed a little bit closer to the body, or maybe it's just being that they were swept, the wings were swept further back. It just kind of ended up being that way. But it also had a butterfly tail, which itself it's kind of like a V tail. I believe it's the actual naming for it. I believe it's butterfly tail, but I've also heard V tail used. And this was another way that they reduced drag. And there's reports that this was just a model that they had created, like a scale model or a wind tunnel. But I've also heard that it's flown. The HG1 for sure had flown, and it had reached, more likely than not, that 606 mile per hour top speed. Again, that's in level flight. But the HG2, it seems like there's more evidence towards it flying, but I haven't really read anything yet saying one thing or another definitively. So this being said, unfortunately, both prototypes, the HG1, which was the V9 airframe, and the HG2, which itself was the V12 airframe, they had been destroyed. The HG2, more tragically, had been destroyed in the last week of the war. I read that it had been destroyed, and I'll try to include the links for at least some of the claims I'm making. I had read that it was destroyed in May of 45, which would place it in the last week of the European war. And that is tragic, because such a plane, much like the Horton 229, it's a revolution in design, and whether or not it would have have done much. Whether or not it would be stable in flight, who knows? But the fact that they created it in their desperation and that it was just destroyed in the last week of the war really, really stinks, to put it bluntly. The HG-1, I believe, was destroyed in 44, if I'm not mistaken, from a bombing raid. But from what I had picked up, the HG-2 was in some sort of, and I quote, runway incident. And again, I'll try to post that citation underneath. So one would imagine that, again, these prototypes, if they were put in production, and any Messerschmitt prototype, the Me-262 and or actual production vehicle, plus all the other planes that they were looking at making, like the P1101, I believe it is, that those would have either upgraded engines, like the 004E, or I believe it was the HES-11, which itself was a monstrously powerful engine relative to the Junkers Jumbo 004, even with the afterburners, and would really probably be able to fling an aircraft quite fast. This kind of goes into the HG3, which itself would have had those HES engines, which produce significantly more power compared to the Jumo 004. Now, let me just see here. So the power in the C variant would have been around 16.7 kilonewtons, which was essentially, and that was not built, but the one that was built, pre-production variant, it was intended to provide, and this was the A0, 12.7 kilonewtons, which by itself is more than even the 004E with afterburners, and significantly more, about 50% more power than the regular 004B, which was used in production, most production Me-262s. Now, again, this is kind of going into theory crafting here. I'm not trying to get off the point way too much, but it's an interesting point to be made. And this is kind of the argument for all the Luftwaffe 46 planes and all that. What would have happened if they would have been around for another 6 months or a year or whatever? It's impossible to say. The technology was being developed, and oftentimes it was there. It existed. The HG3, however, did not. The HG3 would have had these HES 11 plane or jet engines, and it would have had a further swept, or I believe it was slightly further swept back wings compared to the HG2, but not by much. It might have been about a 3.5 degree difference, if I'm not mistaken. 35 degrees compared to 38.5. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But another interesting feature would have been that the engines would have finally been placed to be integrated into the fuselage, which would have likely decreased drag significantly. Now, as you might be able to tell, the HG series were more or less an exercise in speed and maneuverability, something that the regular Me-262 1A did not have a ton of maneuverability. It had speed, but the acceleration was an issue, so on and so forth. So these would have likely added, at least been a benefit to some of the things that was failing on. Whether or not they would have worked because the designs were so radical for the time, it's impossible to say. But the HG3 was a paper design. It was never made, never a prototype. There might have been a wind model, like a small scale wind tunnel model, but that was it. So going into War Thunder, I've spent almost 19 minutes talking about just the history and kind of the application of the HG series. Now, I believe it was 6 years ago, in 2013, Gaijin had more or less released a roadmap showing that they would include the HG2, which would then imply that they're going to include the HG1. So they haven't done that yet. It's been years. I mean, essentially over a half decade now. It's been a while. And one must wonder, they've included things like the Horton 229 and other more or less paper designs or one-off prototypes that just were really not produced. Just the E100, for example, was not even a full tank. The Mouse there were only 2 examples of that made. And again, the E100, you can only get that with a by buying it for, I've seen prices over $1,500 or $300 depending on what day it is, right, in the game. So the HG-1, being that it was an actually flown aircraft, should be included in the game. I'm kind of wondering why it wasn't. It was not a huge derivation off the design of the regular ME-262 1A, so it shouldn't be all too much different than it. It should maybe get obviously an upgraded model because it does look different. The canopy is lower, maybe shine it up a little bit to show that it's a little bit lower on drag, and increase the speed by 60 or so miles per hour, about 100 kilometers per hour. I think that would be awesome for the game. It would get a lot of people to join, and it would really show that Gaijin has an interest in improving these designs, right? The ME-262 and the Comet were essentially the varieties of the Comet and the ME-262 were, that's it. After that, you get post-war aircraft that were not German-made, at least as of right now. I mean, essentially, you're jumping from the 8, right, the 8BR ME-262 C1A to the the CL-13, which was a Canadian F-86 built vehicle, or a Canadian built F-86. So that's a huge jump, 8 to 9. I mean, you can't include an 8.3 or an 8.7. So in my, what I believe, the HG series is not as big of a jump, especially the HG1 from the regular 1A. It's not nearly as big of a jump as the C series, especially the C2B, is from the, the 1A. It's not nearly that big of a jump. One could make an argument that the C2B should be an 8.3 versus the 8 that it shares with the regular C1A, which only has one rocket engine as compared to 2. So this being said, where I think it should be, with slightly better maneuverability, quite a bit higher of a top speed, and potentially a little bit better acceleration, I really think that the HG1 should either occupy the 7.3 battle rating and maybe have the ME-262 1A drop down to 7, or have it occupy a 7.7 rating and keep the ME-262 where it is. Now, this is kind of, I could see anyone arguing one way or the other for this, but I think that there's enough of a change, especially when it comes to top speed, that it warrants a slightly higher BR compared to the base model ME-262. The HG2, if they were to put this in, and they had said they would, they haven't done it yet, but if they were to put this in, being that was a more radical design with the tail, the further swept back wings, I could imagine if this were to go faster, have better maneuverability still compared to the HG1, I would imagine that this would be something, another 0.3 or 0.4 BR higher than the HG1. You could argue that the HG1 and the HG2 share the same space, but have it kind of be like, what's a good example of it? Like when you click on a plane and then the drop down comes down, you might have one at 5 battle rating, one at 5.3, so on and so forth. This could arguably be like that. I would not have an issue with that. So I could see depending on where the ME-262 and the HG1 land, I could see the HG2 being a 7.7 or even possibly an 8. I don't know if it would warrant being an 8. It would have to have significantly higher performance characteristics compared to the regular ME-262, which it might, but I just don't really know if it would be there. I mean, you're taking the C1A and the C2B, which have tremendous acceleration. My current KD with the C1A in arcade is something like 2.5, which is, in my opinion, excellent. And that's because I'm able to reach altitude faster than almost anyone else and hit bombers and also fighter planes with more power than they could muster against me. And it's really a boon. So the HG2 is not that radical, especially the HG1, not that radical of a design change and will not grant that much extra acceleration. So it's tough to say if they should even be in the C rating, but I really think that Germany needs something in the mid 7s and also in the mid 8s. Some design that was created by Germany is just really difficult at this point because the Me-262 was the ultimate plane that Germany made. They made the P-1101, if I'm not mistaken. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. It's the P-1101, which had swept wings, and it was actually scheduled to fly within just a few weeks after Germany had actually capitulated. So it never did fly, but we took it back and we actually developed an X-plane out of it that had variable sweep wings in flight. I believe it was the Bell X-5. Tremendous plane, could go extremely fast, and they took the P-1101 design and just adapted it to an American design with slightly better technology and better thrust. So really just incredible designs, and that plane did exist. One could make an argument that you should put that in War Thunder as well, potentially as a premium, potentially as just a regular researched plane. But that would be a perfect spot for the mid eights that Germany is really lacking. I mean, it's tough because if you want to fly the MiG 15, which is I haven't flown that in so long, because the eights, especially the Ma 262s, have such a difficult time competing with post World War II jets. Right now, I'm seeing against the Me 262C 1A, I'm facing F-86 A5s, which are not all that crazy. I mean, it's still a challenge, but it's not incredible. It's not like facing an F2 or an F-100 or the Soviet counterparts. And to that point, and I'll be over in just a moment here. But to that point as well, you can make the argument that being that the Me-262 essentially was a design from the 30s. I mean, it wasn't properly implemented until the early 40s, but it's a 30s design that's facing late 40s, early 50s designs, which one speaks to the great power of the Me-262 and how great of a design it was, but also speaks to the fact that Germany really is lacking, and I think that their BRs are possibly, if anything, maybe a little bit too high. It's just such a difficult place to be because you want them. I think there's almost like an artificial inflation here where Germany has. They're kind of forced to play at these higher BRs, otherwise they would have no planes there, right? I think that if a new plane like the HG series were to come in and kind of properly place themselves, then you would see the Me-262 as well as potentially the Horton 229. I don't think it should be a lower BR, but potentially slip into a slightly lower BR rating. It's just there's a lot going on here, and I really think that there's a lot of room for improvement in Germany's jet situation, but also in just how they implement it. I do not know why the HG1 is not in the game yet, nor do I know why after 6 years, after basically promising 6 years later, the HG2 is not in the game either. But I'm hoping there needs to be some sort of a shakeup in the German jet tree. After the 2B, there's nothing. Nothing, and it's just so tough to fly the German jets, the post-war German jets that they get, which are Russian and American made, or Canadian made, I guess. It's just so tough because you have nothing to support them if your plane crashes. There's no impetus, there's no reason why you'd want to play those, because jumping into an Me-262, regardless of the variant, at this point, it may as well just be destroyed the moment I get into it, versus the higher tier planes like the F-86 F2, which would just annihilate anyone. So anyways, thanks guys. I kind of rambled on. I was expecting this video to be about half this long, but I do have a difficult time shutting my yapper. So again, thanks so much guys. This is all kind of an improvised video. I've been wanting to come up with this for a few days now, and I'm finally doing it. If you could like and subscribe, that would mean the world to me. I would really appreciate it. I'm really looking to get that 1,000 subscriber mark so I can once again monetize my channel. I used to monetize it and I was actually making some money on it, but once that got taken away from me due to a certain YouTuber, my opportunity to monetize it had failed. So, I'm just really looking to do that, and it would, again, mean the world to me. So anyways, I'll see you guys on. Probably be making some streams, some other videos soon enough, depending on the reaction to this. And I really, really hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, thanks so much, and see you guys in the sky. Take care.